In the dry and sun-scorched lands of ancient Israel, where dust rose from parched fields and kingdoms trembled under the weight of political unrest, a powerful and mysterious story began to unfold around a man whose name would echo through generations, Elisha, a prophet whose authority made kings uneasy and whose miracles gave hope to the desperate. Long before he commanded rivers to part or spoke words that altered the course of nations, Elisha was simply the son of a humble farmer in the small town of Abel Maholah, a quiet settlement nestled in the Jordan Valley. His name meant God is salvation, and though no one could yet see the magnitude of his destiny, there was already a quiet sense that his life would not remain ordinary. He grew up working the fields beside his father, rising with the sun, guiding oxen through hardened soil, and living the steady rhythm of agricultural life. There were no signs of grandeur in those early years, no royal upbringing, no prophetic visions recorded, just a faithful son committed to his responsibilities. Yet heaven was preparing to interrupt his routine in a way that would forever divide his life into before and after. One fateful day, as Elisha was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, the renowned prophet Elijah approached him. Elijah was already a legend in Israel, a fierce and uncompromising man of God who had confronted wicked kings and called down fire from heaven. Without speaking a word, Elijah removed his mantle, the symbolic cloak of prophetic authority, and threw it upon Elisha's shoulders. In that single gesture lay a divine summons more powerful than any spoken command. Elisha understood immediately what it meant. He was being called to leave behind his family, his inheritance, his security, and step into a life defined by surrender and obedience to God. Without hesitation, he ran after Elijah and asked only to kiss his parents goodbye. Then, in a bold act of finality, he slaughtered his oxen, burned his plowing equipment to cook the meat, and shared it with the people. It was a symbolic severing from his past, no plow to return to, no safety net waiting behind him. The farmer had chosen the unknown path of prophetic service. From that moment forward, Elisha devoted himself fully to Elijah, becoming not merely a student, but a servant. He poured water on Elijah's hands, attended to his needs, walked where he walked, and watched carefully how he lived and ministered. His devotion was marked by humility. Though he had been called to greatness, he first embraced obscurity. Years passed in faithful service, and as Elijah's earthly ministry drew to a close, an air of solemn anticipation surrounded them. Several times Elijah urged Elisha to remain behind while he traveled to Bethel, Jericho, and finally toward the Jordan River, but Elisha refused to leave his side. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you," he declared with unwavering loyalty. He knew the time of transition was near, and he would not miss the moment. When they reached the Jordan, Elijah rolled up his mantle and struck the water, and the river parted, allowing them to cross on dry ground, a breathtaking display of divine power that mirrored the miracles of Moses and Joshua. Standing on the other side, Elijah asked what he could do for Elisha before he was taken away. With bold faith, Elisha requested a double portion of Elijah's spirit, not out of ambition for fame, but out of recognition that the calling ahead would require even greater spiritual strength. Elijah responded that it was a difficult request, but if Elisha witnessed his departure, it would be granted. Suddenly, as they walked and talked, a chariot of fire with horses of fire appeared and separated the two men, and Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. The sight was overwhelming, flames against the sky, wind roaring with supernatural force, and Elisha cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel!" In that instant, the mantle of leadership truly fell. Elijah was gone, but his cloak descended gently to the ground. Elisha tore his own garments in grief, then picked up the fallen mantle, the symbol of prophetic authority now resting upon him. Alone, but empowered, he returned to the banks of the Jordan River. The watching prophets stood at a distance, wondering what would happen next. With steady resolve, Elisha struck the waters with Elijah's mantle and declared, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" Immediately, the river parted once again. It was his first recorded miracle, a divine confirmation that the same God who worked through Elijah was now working through him. The once quiet farmer from Abel Meholah had stepped fully into his calling. Heaven had transferred authority, and Israel had received a new prophet. The journey of miracles, mystery, and divine power had only just begun. After the mantle of prophetic authority had unmistakably passed to Elisha, his ministry quickly moved from quiet confirmation to public demonstration, and the power of God began to flow through him in ways that both restored the broken and terrified the rebellious, revealing that the same divine authority that once rested on Elijah was now actively at work in Israel through this new prophet. Elisha's first public miracle took place in the ancient city of Jericho, a place rich in history but plagued by a devastating problem. The water source was poisoned and the land was unproductive, threatening the survival of its people. The men of the city came to Elisha in desperation, acknowledging that the location was good but the water was bad, and Elisha responded not with elaborate rituals, but with quiet confidence in God's power. He asked for a new bowl and some salt, then went to the spring, threw the salt into the water, and declared that the Lord had healed it, proclaiming that there would no longer be death or barrenness from that source. Instantly, the waters were purified, and the land was restored to fruitfulness, a miracle that established Elisha as a prophet not only of judgment, but of healing and life, one through whom God brought renewal to entire communities. Yet Elisha's authority was not to be taken lightly, and this truth was soon made unmistakably clear as he traveled from Jericho toward Bethel. Along the road, a group of young boys came out of the city and mocked him, repeatedly calling him baldhead, a term that carried more than mere insult, as it was an act of public contempt toward God's appointed prophet and, by extension, toward God himself. Their mockery was not innocent teasing, but a deliberate rejection of divine authority, and Elisha, turning back, pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Immediately, 2 bears emerged from the nearby forest and mauled 42 of the boys, a shocking and terrifying event that sent a clear message throughout the land that dishonoring God and his servants carried grave consequences. This moment firmly established fear and reverence for Elisha's prophetic office, making it clear that the power resting on him was not symbolic, but real and formidable. As his journey continued, Elisha encountered suffering that called forth not judgment, but compassion, and one of the most powerful demonstrations of God's mercy through him came when a widow approached him in utter desperation. Her husband, a fellow prophet, had died, leaving her buried in debt, and her creditors were about to take her 2 sons as slaves to repay what she owed. Standing before Elisha with nothing but fear and grief, she explained that she had nothing left in her house except a small jar of oil. Elisha instructed her to borrow as many empty vessels as she could from her neighbors, to shut the door behind her, and to begin pouring the oil into them. Obedient and trusting despite the impossibility of the task, she followed his words, and miraculously the oil continued to flow, filling vessel after vessel until there was not a single container left. Only then did the oil stop. She sold the oil, paid off her debts, and lived on what remained, her sons spared from slavery by a miracle that turned near total loss into overflowing provision. Through this act, Elisha revealed a God who saw the powerless, intervened in personal crises, and supplied abundantly in moments of utter hopelessness. As Elisha's reputation grew, so did the contrast between his humble demeanor and the extraordinary power working through him, and nowhere was this more evident than in the town of Shunem, where a wealthy and discerning woman recognized that Elisha was a holy man of God. She insisted on showing him hospitality, providing him with meals whenever he passed through, and eventually persuading her husband to build a small upper room where Elisha could stay. Moved by her generosity and faith, Elisha desired to bless her in return, and though she asked for nothing, he prophesied that she would embrace a son within a year, despite her old age and her husband's advanced years. Just as he had spoken, the child was born, bringing joy and fulfillment to her once quiet home. Yet joy soon turned to devastating sorrow when the child suddenly collapsed and died in her arms years later. Refusing to accept the finality of death, the woman laid the boy on Elisha's bed and rushed to find the prophet, her faith driving her beyond despair. When Elisha returned with her, he prayed earnestly to the Lord and stretched himself over the child, and in a moment of divine intervention, warmth returned to the boy's body, and he sneezed 7 times before opening his eyes. Life had been restored where death had reigned, and the miracle resounded as a testimony that the God who gave life had power to restore it. Through these events, Elisha's ministry became a living declaration that God's power was not distant or theoretical, but active and personal, capable of turning poisoned waters into life-giving springs, desperate widows into witnesses of abundance, and mourning mothers into bearers of restored hope, while at the same time establishing that the authority of heaven, when mocked or resisted, carried consequences no human power could withstand. As Elisha's ministry continued to unfold across Israel and beyond its borders, the reach of God's power through him extended into foreign lands, royal courts, battlefields, and even the hidden motives of men's hearts, proving that divine authority was not confined by geography, status, or circumstance. One of the most striking examples of this came through Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, a man of immense power, prestige, and military success, yet afflicted with leprosy, a disease that no wealth or rank could cure. Though he was a feared warrior, he was also a desperate man, and when a young Israelite servant girl spoke of a prophet in Samaria who could heal him, Naaman set out with letters from his king, silver, gold, and fine garments, expecting a dramatic display worthy of his stature. But when he arrived at Elisha's house, the prophet did not even come out to greet him personally. Instead, he sent a simple message instructing Naaman to wash 7 times in the Jordan River and he would be cleansed. Offended by what he perceived as disrespect and disappointed by the lack of spectacle, Naaman initially turned away in anger, declaring that the rivers of Damascus were superior to the muddy Jordan. Yet his servants reasoned with him, urging him to obey such a simple command. Swallowing his pride, Naaman dipped himself once, twice, until the 7th time, and as he emerged from the water, his flesh was restored like that of a little child, completely healed. In that humbling moment, the mighty commander confessed that there was no God in all the earth except the God of Israel. Elisha refused his lavish gifts, demonstrating that God's power could not be bought or manipulated, that miracles were acts of grace, not transactions of wealth. Yet, where Naaman learned humility, Elisha's servant Gehazi succumbed to greed. Secretly pursuing Naaman, Gehazi fabricated a story and requested silver and clothing in Elisha's name. Naaman, grateful and unsuspecting, gladly gave them. But nothing escapes the eyes of a prophet attuned to God's spirit, and when Gehazi returned, Elisha confronted him, revealing that he had witnessed the entire act in spirit. As judgment for his deceits and covetousness, the leprosy that had once plagued Naaman fell upon Gehazi and his descendants permanently, a sobering reminder that proximity to holy things does not protect a corrupt heart, and that greed in the service of God carries devastating consequences. Even in seemingly smaller matters, Elisha demonstrated that God's concern extended to everyday struggles. When a group of prophetic disciples were building a new dwelling place, one man accidentally dropped a borrowed iron axe head into the Jordan River and in his distress cried out, knowing he could not afford to replace it. Elisha cut a stick, threw it into the water, and the iron miraculously floated to the surface. The man retrieved it, relieved and restored. Though simple compared to parting rivers or healing leprosy, This miracle testified that nothing was too small for divine intervention, that God cared not only for nations and generals, but for borrowed tools and anxious hearts. As tensions between Israel and Aram escalated, Elisha's prophetic insight became a strategic advantage for the nation. Repeatedly, God revealed to him the secret plans of the Aramean king, allowing Israel to avoid ambushes. Frustrated and suspecting betrayal within his ranks, the king of Aram was informed that it was Elisha who disclosed his military movements, even the words spoken in his private chamber. Determined to capture the prophet, the king sent horses and chariots by night to surround the city of Dothan where Elisha was staying. At dawn, Elisha's servant awoke to see the city encircled by a formidable army and panicked in terror. But Elisha remained calm, assuring him that those who were with them were more than those against them. He prayed that the servant's eyes would be opened, and suddenly the young man saw the hills filled with horses and chariots of fire, heavenly armies standing guard. When the Aramean forces advanced, Elisha prayed that they would be struck with blindness, and instantly they were disoriented. He then led them directly into Samaria, into the heart of Israel's capital. Once inside the city, he prayed again, and their sight was restored, revealing that they were surrounded by Israelite forces. The king of Israel, eager to destroy them, asked if he should kill the captives, but Elisha instructed him instead to feed them and send them home. In a stunning act of mercy, a feast was prepared, and the once hostile soldiers were released. After this, the Arameans ceased raiding Israel for a time. Through these events, Elisha demonstrated not only supernatural power, but divine wisdom and compassion, revealing a God who could blind armies, yet choose mercy over massacre, who could expose secrets, yet extend grace, and whose sovereignty over war and peace operated beyond human calculation. As the years passed and Elisha's prophetic authority became deeply woven into the political and spiritual fabric of Israel, his ministry shifted increasingly towards shaping the destinies of kings and nations, proving that the word of the Lord spoken through him carried consequences that would unfold across generations. The Shunammite woman whose son had once been restored to life faced another trial when Elisha warned her of a coming 7-year famine and urged her to leave the land temporarily to survive. Trusting his counsel, she departed with her household to dwell among the Philistines until the famine ended. When she finally returned to Israel, she discovered that her land and property had been seized during her absence. Determined to reclaim what was hers, she went to appeal directly to the king. In a remarkable convergence of timing that bore the unmistakable mark of divine orchestration, Gehazi, now living with the consequences of his leprosy, was at that very moment recounting to the king the great miracles Elisha had performed, including the resurrection of the Shunammite's son. As Gehazi spoke, the woman and her son entered to plead their case. Astonished by the living testimony standing before him, the king immediately ordered that not only her land be restored, but also all the produce it had yielded during her absence. Once again, God demonstrated through Elisha that his favor operates with perfect timing, restoring what was lost and vindicating those who trust his word. Yet, beyond individual restoration, Elisha's prophetic role extended into the turbulent politics of neighboring kingdoms. He traveled to Damascus, where Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, lay gravely ill. The king sent Hazael, one of his trusted officials, with gifts to inquire of Elisha whether he would recover. When Hazael stood before the prophet, Elisha fixed his gaze upon him and began to weep. Troubled, Hazael asked why the man of God was crying. Elisha revealed that he knew Hazael would become king of Aram and would inflict terrible suffering upon Israel, burning strongholds, killing young men, and committing brutal acts of violence. Though Hazael initially dismissed the prophecy as impossible, Elisha declared that the Lord had shown him he would indeed rule. The following day, Hazael suffocated Ben-Hadad and seized the throne, fulfilling the grim words spoken by the prophet. In this moment, Elisha stood not merely as a miracle worker, but as a witness to the sobering reality of divine foreknowledge and human ambition, where God's sovereignty allowed events to unfold even when they carried pain and judgment. Back in Israel, the house of Ahab still cast a long shadow of corruption and idolatry over the nation. In obedience to earlier prophetic declarations, Elisha sent one of the sons of the prophets to secretly anoint Jehu, a commander in Israel's army, as king. The young prophet poured oil on Jehu's head and declared that he was chosen to destroy the house of Ahab and avenge the blood of the Lord's servants shed under Jezebel's influence. Empowered by this divine commission, Jehu acted swiftly and decisively. He confronted King Joram and struck him down, bringing an end to his reign, and then rode toward Jezreel, where Queen Jezebel awaited him. Unrepentant and defiant to the end, Jezebel adorned herself and looked out from an upper window, mocking Jehu as he entered the city. Jehu, unmoved by her arrogance, called out to her attendants and commanded them to throw her down. They obeyed, casting her from the window. Her body struck the ground and was trampled by horses, and when they later went to bury her, only her skull, feet, and hands remained, fulfilling the earlier prophecy that dogs would devour her flesh in Jezreel. Thus, the reign of terror that had promoted Baal worship and persecuted God's prophets came to a violent and prophetic end, exactly as foretold. As Elisha grew old and illness weakened his body, his influence did not diminish. King Joash of Israel came to visit him, weeping and addressing him with the same words Elisha had once cried out for Elijah, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." The king recognized that the true defense of the nation was not in its armies, but in the presence of God working through his prophet. Even on his deathbed, Elisha gave strategic prophetic instruction. He told Joash to take a bow and arrows and shoot out the window eastward, symbolizing victory over Aram. Then he instructed him to strike the ground with the remaining arrows. Joash struck the ground 3 times and stopped. Angered by his lack of persistence, Elisha declared that he should have struck 5 or 6 times. Now Israel would defeat Aram only 3 times instead of achieving complete destruction. In this final act, Elisha demonstrated that faith and zeal directly influenced the measure of victory, and that even kings were accountable to respond fully to God's opportunities. Thus, as his life drew to its close, Elisha remained what he had always been, a vessel through whom God directed the rise and fall of rulers, executed justice against wickedness, restored the faithful, and shaped the destiny of nations through words that could not fail. Elisha's earthly journey eventually came to an end, yet even in death, his life testified that the power of God is not bound by time, flesh, or the grave. And the final chapter of his story stands as one of the most striking affirmations of divine sovereignty in all of Scripture. After years of faithful service, years marked by miracles, prophetic insight, compassion for the broken, and unwavering obedience, Elisha died and was laid to rest, his body placed in a tomb like any other man's, seemingly signaling the conclusion of a remarkable ministry. But God was not finished telling his story through his servant. Sometime later, as a group of Israelites were burying a man, they were suddenly startled by the appearance of a band of Moabite raiders approaching the area. In their fear and haste, with no time to complete proper burial rites, they threw the dead man into the nearest tomb, which happened to be Elisha's. In a moment that defied all human logic, when the corpse touched Elisha's bones, the man immediately came back to life and stood up on his feet. This extraordinary event, occurring long after Elisha had drawn his last breath, served as a powerful and unforgettable declaration that the God who worked through him in life remained fully active in death, and that divine power does not fade with the passing of a human vessel. It was the final miracle associated with Elisha, a closing sign that his calling and anointing were not momentary but enduring, leaving an imprint that reached beyond his lifetime. This climactic moment invites reflection on the deeper lessons woven throughout Elisha's life and legacy. His story teaches that faithfulness in service matters profoundly. Elisha did not begin his journey with public acclaim, but with years of quiet obedience under Elijah, faithfully serving, learning, and waiting. And it was that humility that prepared him to carry a double portion of spiritual authority. His miracles consistently reveal that God is a provider in every circumstance, whether supplying oil for a destitute widow, restoring land to the displaced, feeding multitudes in famine, or intervening in small, overlooked moments like a borrowed axe head. Time and again, Elisha's life shows that when human resources are exhausted, divine provision begins, and that God delights in meeting needs in ways that leave no doubt about their source. Another defining thread in Elisha's legacy is compassion. Though he wielded formidable authority, his heart remained tender toward the suffering, the poor, the grieving, and the forgotten. And it was through that compassion that God brought healing, restoration, and hope to countless lives. At the same time, his story does not shy away from the seriousness of God's holiness, reminding us through moments of judgment that obedience, integrity, and reverence are not optional in a life aligned with divine purpose. Above all, Elisha's life stands as a testament to the sovereignty of God, over sickness and health, over war and peace, over kings and servants, over life and death itself. From blinding enemy armies to revealing hidden plans, from shaping the rise and fall of rulers to performing a miracle from beyond the grave, every chapter of Elisha's story points to a God who is fully in control, working through willing servants to accomplish his purposes in ways that surpass human understanding. Through Elisha, we are reminded that nothing is impossible with God, that obedience opens the door to divine intervention, and that a life surrendered to Him can become a conduit of power, mercy, and transformation far beyond what the world considers reasonable or attainable. Elisha's legacy does not merely belong to ancient history. It stands as an enduring invitation to trust God completely, to serve faithfully even when unseen, and to believe that when God's power is at work, it can bring life out of death, abundance out of emptiness, and hope out of even the darkest circumstances.